introduce our speaker, Jonathan Banks Pracharnanda Das. He has a doctorate in geosciences. He studied renewable energy development as an academic research scientist for 15 years before moving to New Ramanreti in Alachua, Florida, where he teaches math and science at the Bhaktivedanta Academy, North America. I think he will give us a little introduction about his lecture series, but I'd like to introduce this first session titled the Asymptotes. Is that right? Asymptotes?
Asymptotes.
Asymptotes. Thank you. Learned something new today. Asymptotes of knowledge, which will lay the groundwork for the whole series by exploring big picture questions such as the nature of scientific evidence and theories, the causes of religious and spiritual faith, and the ontology of genuine knowledge. So we're going to explore these issues by taking a virtual trip to the Grand Canyon, questioning the existence of deep time. So we're very grateful that he's here, that he's sharing all of this with us. And thank you, all of you who are here in person at the BI headquarters in Gainesville. And thank you to those of you who are online. So you may go ahead, Pracharnanda.
That was, I couldn't have said that better myself. So I think we'll just jump right into it. Yeah, as Leela said, this is the first part of what was originally planned as an 8-part lecture series. I think we might expand it to 10, but we'll see how that goes. There's still interest after the first one. The title of the overall lecture series is Leaps of Faith and Doubt, and I'll talk about that phrase and what that means. Usually we hear about taking a leap of faith, which means to like get involved in something full-heartedly without really knowing what the potential outcomes may be. But maybe we haven't heard about leaps of doubt so much. So I'll get into what this means here in a moment. But first, I want to talk about the title of this first lecture, which is really an introduction to. Oh, well, are we having technical difficulties?
Can everyone hear?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That must have been an old.
Yeah, it is an old one. Yeah.
Okay.
We got a little technical information. All right, continuing. So the title of this sort of introductory lesson, which is setting the stage for the rest of the topics that we'll talk about, is called the Asymptotes of Knowledge. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. Before I get into it too much, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the background of this lecture series. So our Bhaktivedanta Institute here in Alachua and Gainesville has stemmed largely, or has grown largely out of the work of Sadaputra Prabhu, who in, Prishna can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the early 80s, I think, wrote this magazine or helped with the writing of this
84,
magazine.
1984.
So mid 80s, called Origins, in which, excuse me, the leading devotee scientists of the time looked at reigning scientific paradigms through a devotional lens. And we felt, after doing a number of workshops about consciousness and evolution and astronomy and cosmology and really big picture topics in science, that this work needed an update. The reigning scientific paradigms of the time have changed quite a bit, although we still use the same words. The Big Bang, Darwin, evolution, these are still the words we use to talk about science, although the details and the knowledge base of this science has actually changed quite considerably in the last 40 years. So we felt that the content needed an update, and we also thought that we might be able to strike a little bit more of a reconciliatory tone with the scientists. So back maybe in the earlier ages of the Hare Krishna movement, people were very gung-ho about defeating the demoniac scientists, but they might not have had a very good understanding of what the demoniac scientists were actually saying. And so therefore, they were going into battle unprepared and possibly sometimes made themselves look a little foolish. So we also wanted to maybe see where we could find common ground with scientific knowledge rather than an attitude of combativeness. So leaps of faith and doubt. This begins basically with a general question of what does it mean to know something and how do we know what we think we know? And when I used to teach introductory geology classes at the University of Florida, these were classes with 300 undergraduates. I used to do this little exercise on the board. So the scientific method, of course, we know begins with observation and description. So I'd put this cartoon that my friend Shane made up on the board, and I'd say, who can describe what's going on in this cartoon? And, people would say there's a cat crossing a road. People might comment that the colors of the leaves in the back suggest that it might be fall. The length of the shadows, some people might make an interpretation and say that, people might make an interpretation and say that the length of the shadow suggests it's either morning or evening. And they describe the scene in whatever detail. There appears to be a little bit of a fence in the back. And then I would show them this next slide and I would ask the question, what happened? So I'm going to show you the next slide now. And I want you to consider what just happened. I think I'm going to show you the next slide. There we go. What just happened? And invariably, of course, people will say the cat got run over by the car, right? If that's your reaction, you are amongst the normal in an undergraduate geology class. But then I would ask, how do you know that the cat got run over by the car? And then they would start pointing out the different types of evidence of how they know this. Well, just a moment ago, there was a healthy living cat not plastered in a bloody pulp on the road. And now there is a dead cat plastered in a bloody pulp on the road and a car whizzing by really quickly. So there's some circumstantial evidence. And then we talk about how we can dig deeper into this. Well, you can check to see if the tread marks on the cat match the tread marks on the car. And then you could have a little bit more evidence. And you can see if there are like bits of cat in the tread marks of the car. And I know this is getting a little gruesome for Sunday morning, but it does illustrate the point that there are levels of knowing things and there are levels of certainty with which we know things. And then finally, some intelligent student might say, well, you could also ask the driver, did you just run over a cat with your car? And if the driver is a trustworthy source, an authorized source, the driver will be able to report conclusively whether or not he just ran over a cat with a car. Ultimately, there's always a lingering doubt, and that brings us to what I call the asymptotes of knowledge. So this is, excuse me, an asymptote is the graph of a function that approaches but never reaches a limit. So if you're familiar with math, this is a standard conic section equation of a hyperbola. This is a graph of the function y equals 1 divided by x. And so we see that on the x-axis here, as x gets very, very, very big, the y value gets very, very small because it's 1 divided by the x value. But the y value will never become 0. It will never actually touch the x-axis because it's a mathematical axiom that you cannot divide anything by 0. And the opposite is also true. If I make x very, very, very small, then y will become very, very big. Because it's 1 divided by x. But at the same time, the y value will never become infinite because I can always make x smaller between 0 and 1. And the same is true for the negative numbers. So we get this graph of a hyperbola, which is called an asymptote. And I say the asymptotes of knowledge because knowledge is comparable to this. We can always dig deeper into evidence. And I compare going along the x-axis to the truth of the infinitely small. We can always build a better microscope. And microscopes now can start to even see atoms. And this is a very recent development in science that you could see not just the trace of an atom or the activity of an atom, but the the nucleus of an atom itself. And also, we can always build a better telescope. We just launched the James Webb Space Telescope, which is a revolution in telescopes. And even within less than a year of collecting data, it's changing a lot of what we think we know of the early universe. But we can always build a bigger telescope, or we can always build a better microscope. And therefore, we will never be able to see what is most infinitely small or what is most infinitely large. And so there's always something lacking in our knowledge. And when I say leaps of faith and doubt, I'm saying that a religious person, a devotee, or somebody who's interested in pursuing that which cannot be seen, they will take a leap of faith across that line. And they will believe in something, even though there's really no evidence for it. And a scientist, they will take a leap of doubt. they will choose not to believe in anything until they see the evidence for it. And so this seminar series is about how we make these decisions in our own life. When is it appropriate to take a leap of faith? And when is it necessary to take a leap of doubt? So carrying on, just a brief introduction, and if you've been hanging around the Hare Krishnas or introductory philosophy class at university for any length of time, this is probably a little bit of review. But this question about how do we know what we think we know is the study of epistemology. And in the Sanskrit epistemologies, there are basically three kinds of evidence. The word evidence itself is pramana, and there are three kinds of pramanas. There's pratyaksha, which is that which I can directly observe. In a scientific sense, I knew that was going to happen. Excuse me. In a scientific sense, when we talk about direct perception or pratyaksha, we're talking about that which can be measured quantitatively, predominantly. And I'll get more into that in a moment. And then based on what we can perceive and what we can measure, we can draw conclusions. We did not see the car run over the cat, but we were able to draw reasonable conclusions based on what we were able to perceive. And so that's taking perception and data from perception and organizing it into reasonable thoughts and arguments. That's also a valid form of evidence. And there are rules of logic and there are rules of how to evaluate evidence. And then there's finally hearing from an authorized source. You can ask the driver of the car, did you run over the cat? And because he's the driver of the car, he should be considered an authorized source. And so we ask, which one of these are involved in sort of religious or spiritual pursuits, and which ones of these are more involved in scientific pursuits? And the fact of the matter is that they're all involved in both. So if you take a high school science class, you might get a little bit of pratyaksha and some training in Anuman, but mostly what you're getting is Shabda. The science teacher is telling you what they want you to know to finish that test at the end of the year. You get into college, undergraduate studies, you might start to get a little bit more pratyaksha. The lab facilities at a university are a little bit more developed. And the additional evidence from the lab studies can aid in developing how to do Anuman, but still predominantly you're hearing from a guy who has some letters after their name that is very much an authority on what they're talking about. And so you should listen to them because they are the authorized source. And then maybe when you get into grad school, you start really applying the scientific method on your own and you become the Shabda eventually. And it's the same in spiritual life. We take our knowledge from a descending process. It is handed down to us through a disciplic succession. But it makes sense to us. It's not that we accept it blindly. The philosophy of Krishna consciousness makes logical sense. And it makes logical sense because it relates to our own experience in life. We all have some practical realization of Krishna or some practical realization that we are not these bodies. Otherwise, we would not be willing to accept the spiritual austerities we accept into our lives. So a little bit review. I want to talk a little bit more now about the nature of scientific knowledge. So scientific knowledge is a little bit different than faith-based knowledge in that first and foremost, it is quantifiable. You can measure it. Things that we know through science have a mass. They have dimensions. They are affected by other things in the material world in a measurable way. And the measurements that we make on these things are repeatable. A kilometer here, and yes, I'm unabashedly using the metric system throughout this whole presentation. You can send your angry emails. I will answer them in kind. So a kilometer here in the United States of America is something that nobody knows what it is. But a kilometer in Canada is the same as a kilometer in Germany, which is the same as a kilometer in anywhere they're using the metric system. And if I measure something to be a kilometer here in Gainesville, Florida, somebody else should be able to come in here and measure it to be a kilometer also. It's a repeatable measurement. And this gets more complicated when we start to talk about more elaborate experiments. For example, how Henry Cavendish was able to calculate what Newton's big G, the universal gravitation constant, was. This was a very delicate experiment when it was first performed. But it has been repeated ad infinitum since then, and the same result has been derived at. So that is a feature of scientific knowledge, and that it has to be derived through repeatable observations or experiments. Scientific knowledge is peer reviewed, which means you can't just claim that you're right without someone checking your work. There's a system of checks and balances, at least in an ideal sense. And in corporatized science, or what we get in the science and academics these days, this can be tenuous process at best. But in theory, scientific knowledge can be checked by some other qualified authority to verify whether or not your conclusions are correct, or at least line up with what the data says. And because of that, scientific knowledge is also tentative, which means it is subject to change. So people from a religious perspective often criticize science because, today the scientist said this, and then tomorrow the scientist said that. Well, that is a feature of the scientific method. That is not a bug. It's supposed to change. And because it is supposed to change, it's also cumulative. It adds onto itself and it builds up over time. So we would not have had an Albert Einstein without an Isaac Newton. And we wouldn't have had a Newton without a Galileo, and so on and so forth. It builds on itself. And now I'm speaking specifically of our understanding of gravity. Here, these pictures, I have a couple of famous scientists. Anybody up for a pop quiz?
Sorry?
Confirmed by person. This here, the man with the funky top hat and the what would you call that? The fringe, the lace collar.
Yeah.
That's Francis Bacon, the father of the modern scientific method. And the modern scientism or Baconism, this is the philosophy that says that through science, through this scientific method, we should be able to alleviate the sufferings of mankind, or we should be able to elevate the quality of life for humanity. The guy next to him in black and white here, that is Claudius Ptolemy, who is most famous for the geocentric model of the solar system, or the geosystem as it would be if it was geocentric. And although he is often impugned by popular science for having the wrong model, in fact, his model is not wrong at all. And it is quite useful, for example, if we're trying to shoot a rocket ship from Earth to Mars. We put the Earth in the middle and we want to know where Mars is in relation to Earth, not the sun. And so the geocentric model is actually still used by NASA and other space agencies in certain contexts. Next to him, we have Isaac Newton, often considered the world's greatest scientist, often considered a big old jerk too, to the point where he shut himself up as a hermit in his own house for most of his life. Here we have the great bearded one, Charles Darwin. This is Copernicus, who refuted Ptolemy and got in a little bit of trouble with the church, as did a lot of people. And of course, Albert Einstein here. This is how the scientific method basically works. I'm not going to go over this in too much detail because I just want to open it up for discussion as soon as possible. But basically, the scientific method starts with making observations of the natural world around us and gathering data regarding the natural world around us. That data then needs to be organized, and the science of how to classify things is a science unto itself. And there's even a wonderful passage in the Uddhava Gita in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam, where Uddhava starts listing all of these different taxonomies or different classifications of material elements to Krishna. Some people say there are 6 material elements. Some people say there are 8. Some people say there are 10. Other people say there's 16. Which one of these is right? Uddhava asked Krishna. And Krishna said, they are all right. You can classify things in different ways without contradicting yourself. So that's data organization. And when data is organized, we can start to make sense of what we think this all means. We can make an educated guess, or we can make a conjecture that is informed by our observations. That's called hypothesizing. Then we test our hypotheses through experiments, and experimental methods in design is unto itself a science. So I can say that when I did my PhD, I did not get a PhD for coming up with some grand results from an experiment. I got the PhD for designing the experiment that somebody else could come up with some grand designs for. And the people that award these things thought that was sufficient. Mostly because I don't think they read it that carefully, but that is a different story altogether. How do I know they didn't read it that carefully? I snuck a paragraph into my doctoral dissertation buried way in the middle that was lifted out of Tolkien, and only one of the 4 people that were reading it caught it.
Didn't.
Did. It's a classic trick. Sorry, kids. Sorry if I'm corrupting the youth here. Anyway, we do our results. We get the results from the experiment. We interpret them. We communicate them to the public. And based on the feedback that we get from peer review and whether or not, the experiments worked as planned, we repeat the process over and over again. One thing that I left out here is that another feature of scientific knowledge is scientific knowledge has to be predictive. It has to be able to accurately predict some outcome in the future. And we will see that most of the reigning scientific theories of our time have predicted things in the future that they did not have the technology to know about at the time the theory developed. Before taking a little trip to the Grand Canyon, I do just want to mention, I don't have any slides or any bullet points about this, but I do want to mention some of the features of faith-based knowledge. So what I call evidence-based knowledge here is generally organized under the monolith of what we call science. Faith-based knowledge is generally organized under the monolith of what we call religion. And there are functions of religion in society that are very important and necessary, regardless of whether or not we have any evidence for what we are believing. For example, all religions in the world provide a center for people to congregate. They provide a central pivot around which to build a society. And then because they attract that type of community, they also provide structure and rules by which to regulate that community. We call that Varna Ashram. And other religious faiths or religious institutions have different ways of doing this. Religions provide answers to that which we cannot know. Why are those stars really shining in the sky? And we can delve into that question, and we do know a lot about why those stars are shining in the sky. But ultimately, there will always be another unanswered question. And even knowing about how hydrogen nuclei combine to form helium nuclei and how that lights up the entire night sky, there's so much we don't know about how those hydrogen nuclei got there, right? So you can always dig deeper. Religions provide a place for us to, well, I always get a little emotional when I say this. They provide a place for us to share in our joy and comfort each other in times of loss and sadness. And we've had a lot of that in our community recently.
Yes, too much.
And they also provide a place for the exercise of ritual, and ritual is the process of developing faith in much the same way that what I have listed here. This is the process of accumulating or developing scientific knowledge. Ritual is the process by which we accumulate faith. So the practice of my faith is in chantam japa. The practice of my faith is in going to the temple, is in stealing maha from the kitchen, sneaking a third plate of Sunday feast prasadam away from Hanan. That is the practice of my faith. And so religion provides context and a space for doing this. And so although, religion might not have made an iPhone, it does provide nonetheless very important and necessary functions in our life, which is not to say that iPhones aren't important and necessary functions in our life. Anyway, a couple of interesting pictures here, and I just want to point out a few of these guys here. This is Tycho Brahe, who was that's a very nice comment from Christina. Thank you. Yeah. This is Tycho Brahe, who sat in this little astronomical observatory that he built. And he just studied the stars. He did not draw any conclusions. He just took copious notes about the movement of stars in the heaven over many, many years, without trying to interpret any of them. So he was very much in the data gathering and observation here. The guy underneath him, this is Johannes Kepler, who is famous for discovering or elucidating the laws of planetary motion. He took Brahe's data and was able to uncover these really seemingly immutable laws that govern not only planets in our solar system, but also exoplanets that we've discovered in the intervening centuries. But out of the beginning of Brahe's work studying stars, over the centuries, we've developed this very famous graph here, which is called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, which shows the life cycle of stars based on their color spectrum and their apparent luminosity in the sky versus the absolute magnitude of their power. And by accumulating, and I'm talking now millions upon data points over centuries, scientists have constructed this curve, which shows what happens to a star with up to 3 solar masses versus what happens to a star with more than 3 solar masses. Namely, these ones eventually become a red giant and then burn out and become a dying white ember. And these ones, because of their additional mass, they explode in ginormous supernova. So this is how science is both tentative and cumulative. All right, to the Grand Canyon. How does this work in practice? This is the United States of America. This is a topographical or a relief map of the United States, we say. And the area that I've circled here broadly circles an area of the United States called the Colorado Plateau. The mountains to the east of the Colorado Plateau arose during the Mesozoic time period when the dinosaurs lived, and the Colorado River drained them to the west as it does now. Sometime in the intervening time, this area that I've circled, and it's a little smaller than the area that I've circled, this lifted up as a gigantic continental block, and it incised the river through the uplifted strata, leaving us, among other places, the grandest of canyons in America, the Grand Canyon. And this is a really interesting, I mean, if you've never been to the Grand Canyon, it's not called the Grand Canyon without reason. It is really spectacular. I'm not a big fan of overrated or overhyped national parks, but you got to go see it. But this is a really interesting geological feature because, and I'm going to pick on born again Christians here for a moment, for now, and then more later. But this is an interesting geological feature because Christians, born again Christians, or I should say young earth creationists, not all born again Christians believe this, but there is a sect of born again Christians called young earth creationists who believe the earth is about 6,000 years old. And they point to the Grand Canyon as evidence of a gigantic flood. And they will go through the successive strata in the Grand Canyon, gather all kinds of data using rigorous geologic methods, and come to the conclusion that this is 6,000 years old, less than 6,000 years old. Scientists will go to the same Grand Canyon and using the same rigorous scientific methods, come to the conclusion that the Grand Canyon is actually 2 canyons. There's a canyon sitting on the top, which ends at this trail that leads out to that overlook there. And then there's a canyon below it. And the canyon below it is in fact much, much older than the canyon above it, which is also really, really old. So the upper canyon is Mesozoic strata and older. I think there's a sandstone at the bottom. Yeah, the Tapete sandstone at the bottom is a Paleozoic strata that formed in the Cambrian time period, which was about 500 million years ago. And it ranges up to the end of the Mesozoic here on the top. So there's a few 100 million years of geologic strata shown in this picture here, and in this picture here. But beneath this upper canyon are the Tapete sandstone, which is 3A here. And you can see that big cliff, or you can see where it kind of slopes out in the green, and then there's a big cliff there. Beneath that, there are rocks that are 1.7 billion years old, according to modern scientists. The names of these rocks are the Vishnu schist, by the way. I don't know why they're named the Vishnu schist, but they are. And the Vishnu schist is extremely old. So, but even the upper canyon, even the younger canyon, is much older than the Christians would say, or the young earth creationists who say it's 6,000 years old. So how do we reconcile this? How do we know these people are using basically the same tools and drawing completely different conclusions? This raises the issue of falsifiability. We can show that the young earth model is wrong. We cannot prove that what the modern scientific knowledge we cannot prove that the modern scientific knowledge is correct, but until now, no one has shown that it's wrong. And that brings us to another feature of scientific knowledge, which it has to be falsifiable. A scientific claim has to be able to be proved wrong. And so the Christian claim, or the young earth creationist claim, I should say, I'm sorry, is that this is all 6,000 years old. But if you know about radiometric dating, you can date these rocks to be much older than that. So they are only dealing with relative ages. Modern geology has progressed to the point of being able to use absolute age dating using radiometric isotopes of long-lived isotopes of uranium and potassium and things like that. So, but the interesting thing here now that I want to, so there is some conclusive knowledge about the age of this canyon, but what is inconclusive is what is in that squiggly gap between 3A and the stuff lying underneath it. So I drew a line here on, so there's the Tapete sandstone above that big cliff forming unit. And then there's all the black gunky stuff on the bottom, which is the Vishnu schist. And so if you can do math in your head here pretty quickly, like I know Prishni can, that is a missing 1.15 billion years of geologic record there. 1.15 billion years of geologic record. Archaeologists will say that modern humans have lived for less than 1 million years. So just to put that on a scale of magnitude, that is what is that? 10,000 times longer, I think. I might have gotten that math wrong in my head. Don't hold me on it. This is not a math test. What I'm trying to say is there's a huge gap of missing time between these two rock layers. And so whatever geologic or anthropological history might have existed in that time frame is just simply lost to our knowledge. We have no real way of knowing there. And so this becomes an area where a leap of faith can be appropriate because there's really no way and nobody that can tell me otherwise. And so I can take a leap of faith without compromising my integrity. But not only this is a geologic feature in North America called the Great Unconformity, and the Great Unconformity is not localized to the Grand Canyon. It's found as far north as the Grand Tetons, which is basically the northern rim of that is Yellowstone National Park in the Grand Tetons, and it is found, you know, it's found in the Colorado National Monument in Grand Junction, Colorado, which is a little bit more to the center east side of where that circle is, and so on and so forth. And so this is the land area, if you were to trace out a ring of the Great Unconformity, this is the land area of this missing chunk of geologic time in the rock record in the Western United States alone. And I did a little bit of a thought experiment. So one of the theories we'll look at from the Bhagavatam perspective is that humanity is in fact much, much older than the anthropologists tell us. And there have been advanced modern humans on this planet for at least millions of years, if not billions of years as well. And so the question from a scientific perspective, well, if that's true, why isn't there any evidence of it? Or where is the evidence of it? And so I just did a little thought experiment with the Great Unconformity. This represents a time span of about 1.1 billion years, and it covers a geographic extent of about 10 million square kilometers. I compared this with the Roman Empire, which was one of the largest, not the largest, but one of the largest empires known to humanity. That existed for roughly 2,000 years, and it covered a geographic extent of about 6.5 million kilometers. And so if we compare these two things, you could see that almost 1 million Roman empires could have risen and fallen within the space defined by the Great Unconformity, and there would be absolutely no evidence of its existence.
Wow.
And that's not like we're missing a week of newspapers in our library from 1968. That's 1 billion years of geologic time. So what do we really know about the Earth? As a geologist, I can explain what we know about the geology of the Grand Canyon in great detail, much greater detail than I just did. And they extrapolate this to all of the rock record, and they use this to further their theories or further their knowledge. But in reality, we really know nothing. This is the asymptote of knowledge. That gap between what we're able to observe and what is the actual truth of the matter can never actually be spanned. And so in this seminar series, after I go through a number of scientific theories and discuss how they relate to what our scriptures may say about them, I'm actually going to present a different understanding of what it means to know or what knowledge is in general. And so I just want to read these Bhagavad Gita verses to you in conclusion. This is Bhagavad Gita 13, 8 through 12. It says humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, control, renunciation of the objects of the senses, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, Krishna, not me, Pachananda, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and the philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be to knowledge, and besides this, whatever there may be as ignorance. So here Krishna is presenting a different paradigm of what knowledge overall is, and that knowledge is not a set of facts that we've accumulated over time that gives us an understanding of the world we live in. Knowledge is actually a set of qualities that we develop as part of the growth and evolution of our consciousness. And that, the thesis of this seminar series is that the process of doing this, the process of developing these qualities in our life, that is the real science of self-realization. It's not in trying to reconcile what modern science says with scientific content of the Bhagavatam. It's understanding how to use the scientific method to cultivate real knowledge as defined by these qualities in our lives. So I'm going to stop there and see if we can have a discussion about any of this. Oh, I can stop sharing my screen, I think. There we go.
Appropriate, or is that at the end?
I'm going back for some.
I know this isn't a math class, but I just wanted to
Go for it. No, go for it. Go for it.
the toad graph. Yeah, this is very small, but just for the benefit of any mathematicians who may be listening to this in the future. So the part where the x gets very big and the y approaches zero, that's not because of like you can't divide one by zero, but it's because you can never divide one by a number large enough so that it becomes zero.
Same thing. They're basically the same thing, though.
It's a good explanation.
So that's the other part of it.
Yeah, but it's basically it's the same thing.
I think that's a good explanation about why
Yes.
you can't divide by zero.
Yes, I think that's what you just did. That's why you can't divide by zero.
Right, but it's like
Yeah.
but x is getting very big.
Yeah.
It's just not zero.
Thank you. Christian.
I was very interested in this idea. It's an important idea that scientific knowledge is tentative. But I've been a Hare Krishna for 50 years. And so, we have the two, you have the Book of God and you have the Book of Nature. That's Francis Bacon, who you showed there. And so what I would like to suggest is that what's tentative about science is also tentative about pursuing spiritual truth. And it's not the book of knowledge or the book of nature that's tentative, it's our understanding. And it's quite surprising as you practice devotional service over decades that your understanding of the nature of spiritual knowledge shifts. It changes and it's cumulative as well. So I think that's an important distinction that a lot of people don't make, is they say, well, science is always changing. It's the understanding of nature that's changing. The nature itself isn't changing. And I think it's important, at least for me, in your spiritual development, that you have a similar approach, that you, just because you understood something when you were first a devotee, doesn't mean that understanding is where you need to fixate yourself. You have to constantly, there's a famous quote by Nietzsche. Someone criticized him after 30 years into his career. Well, back 30 years ago, you said this. And he said, that was a stepping stone to where I am now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to say that.
That's nice. Yeah, certainly we should not become complacent in our spiritual lives. Yeah. Jonathan.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. This is like what I've been hungry for, man. Science versus creationism. I am a newly baptized Episcopal, but I am not a what were they? A young Earth
A young Earth creationist. No, I don't mean to conflate
No.
Christianity at large with young Earth creationism.
I very much am wanting to grow in the Vedic knowledge of creationism. So, having said that, one of the first things that always attracted me to the understanding of the science of the Vedics is multiverse
Mm.
theory,
Mm.
and that um the Vaishnavas had mapped that out before it became a scientific theory. Is that correct, or is that
That is
something you
correct.
can speak
Yeah,
on?
I don't know if I'd say the Vaishnavas have mapped it out, but certainly the theology and the cosmology of the Bhagavat elucidated a multiverse millennia, at least, before modern science started talking about a multiverse, which is Stita D. Muni can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is certainly something that's only arisen within the last 100 years and probably more recently than that. Yeah, something that came out after quantum physics, so certainly within the last 100 years. It seems like quantum physics is like some new thing, but it's not anymore.
Mhm.
People have been studying quantum physics for a long time, so I'm
Years,
losing
yeah.
my perspective this
Yeah.
time.
Multiverse theory is another one of those examples of something that we can't really know.
Mm.
There's a question on, well, thank you first, before we continue this conversation. Two things. Thank you very much. This was extremely interesting and enlightening. Really, I think we can have an ongoing discussion about this for a very long time. This is something that Stita D. Muni wrote in the chat. How can religion provide answers to that which we cannot know? If we can't know it, how are we going to get an answer? And then Christina, I think, appropriately said, know is a romantically overloaded verb. Also, truth as a noun, it's just, everyone has an idea about what truth is and different kinds of truth. So we're struggling with the language.
Christina, chime in there. I'm going to let Steve fight with her about it.
Okay.
I will say that to answer, so Steve did ask a question here. How can religion provide answers to that which we cannot know? Well, that is the nature of faith, is that I believe it even though I don't know it. Um, you know, and that is echoed through many different scriptures. So, Jesus said, "Blessed are you who have not seen but still believe." Um, Prabhupada describes faith as unflinching trust in that which is sublime. So sublime, I don't have the dictionary definition in front of me, but sublime is related to subtle. It's related to not fully manifest or apparent. And so that is the nature of faith-based, quote, knowledge. And yeah, we can discuss what the word knowledge means. Yeah, yes. I guess we're getting back to how to define knowing. And so the point is that there are different kinds of knowledge. There's not just one kind of knowledge, and there's also not just one kind of learning, which is related to that. I think you asked me. No, that was Rohini Kumar. Anyway,
Seeing,
yeah.
knowing.
Sometimes it is. Well, okay, so let me use this as a plug for, and we'll come back over here in a moment, but let me use this as a plug for next week's lecture on everybody's favorite topic, the Bhugola. So we're starting with the low-hanging fruit with like flat eartherism here next week. Invite all your friends. And as we know, if you go stand on the shore of the ocean, I wrote this in an article that I wrote about flat earth. If you go stand on a beach just south of San Francisco and look due west over the Pacific Ocean, you will see that the horizon looks flat. No doubt about it. If you look at the horizon west over the ocean, it looks flat. But this is not very advanced seeing. If your hypothesis is that I'll save that one for later. This is not very advanced seeing. More advanced seeing would be to watch the behavior of a boat as it sails over the horizon. So I have a hypothesis now that the Earth is flat. If the Earth is flat, I would expect that boat to fall off the horizon when it sails over the horizon. And I would also expect to be able to see it until it falls off the horizon. Why would I not be able to see it? Maybe my eyes aren't strong enough, but I can certainly get a telescope. I mean, I can get a telescope that can see Saturn. So I can see the boat sailing off the edge of the Earth, but I don't see the Earth that's sailing over the edge of the Earth. I see, if I were to point that telescope, I would see the stars at a tangent to the point of the Earth where I'm standing. So from a scientific sense, seeing is not just looking with my eyes and registering electromagnetic vibrations passively with my optic nerve and whatnot. Seeing this requires some training. You need to be taught how to see. We need to be taught how to hear. We need to be taught how to use our senses for scientific inquiry. And that's what we should be teaching people in school. That's why I gave up my career as a researcher to teach people in school, because it's not the content of science that is important. It's how to apply the scientific method that's important. And this requires some training in how to think, and seeing is a part of that. A little bit of a rant there. Go ahead. Yeah, you want to say something? Yeah.
Just talk about like the Socratic method a little
Yeah.
bit, right? So the Socratic method is like Socrates was like, okay, let's say I have someone here who doesn't know some, scientific fact like like the Pythagorean theorem, the a squared, the square of the legs of the right angled triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. But then I ask them a series of questions that kind of like lead up to that realization, and they can kind of figure it out by themselves. That shows that we have this kind of capacity for reason and understanding within us, but it just kind of it needs a little bit of like prodding, like it needs a little bit of like encouragement from someone who's maybe a little bit more knowledgeable about these things, or has kind of done the thought experiments or whatever before, but it's like there already. So I think this is an interesting way to answer Studity Mooney's question: how can religion provide answers to that which we cannot know? I mean, if we can't know it, how are we going to get an answer? It's not that like we don't have the answers inside us and religion has all the answers, and therefore they just have to we're just a blank slate and they just have to give us the answer, and then we know the answer. It's kind of this like there's kind of two parts to it. There's sort of the internal capacity for reason and knowing and understanding that we all have, and then there's kind of this external component that sort of that sort of awakens that capacity within us. And I think that's how to look at it.
I think awakening that capacity within us is really the purpose of education. Yeah.
We have a hand up by Ishwar, and any of you that are online, you're welcome to raise a hand, put something in the chat box, or any questions or comments. So Ishwar, go ahead, please.
If you're gonna ask a question, it would also be nice if you could turn your camera on.
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Hare Krishna. So I want to first thank you for inviting me for the session that you have here. I'm really, really appreciative of this. And the reason I say that is because it's very refreshing to hear that there has been a handshake going on between science and ISKCON. Sometimes I find that when I ask certain questions, it comes over as bold or even rude or rebellious when it comes to these topics. And because it shuts people up, and probably this is one of the reasons I have been with ISKCON, I have been with Krishna, but I have never become initiated, because there are certain things in me that is rested there, it's unanswered, and until I get an answer, I'm so stubborn, I will not move forward. That's who I am, and I can't help it being that way. One of the Mataji that mentioned tentative. The question I have really is, tentative and cumulative you mentioned in the scientific process. Does that make it delay the process of accepting the Vedas as the authority? In other words, ultimately, do you move with the assumption that one day the final ultimatum of the tentative and cumulative process will reconcile with what is stated in the Vedas? That's my first question. Can I go off with the second one, please? You did mention the flat Earth, which is what you're going to be covering next week, and I'm very much looking forward for that as well. And the other one is that are you going to be covering the moon landing dispute in the future?
I actually hadn't thought about that. Let me answer your second question first, and then I'll circle back to your first question.
Sure.
So, yeah. So when we sent out the original notifications for this lecture series, I did say that there were going to be 8 of them. I'm thinking about expanding that to 10. Some of the topics we will cover are Big Bang cosmology, the size and the shape of the Earth, Darwin's evolution, do I have the whole list in me? Bhumandala, the size and the shape of Bhumandala and what that means from our observable astronomy. And then we'll start to get a little bit more. So the ones that we're going to add are the one about the flat Earth and then the one about time and the nature of time. The moon landing, I had not planned on getting into it with a formal lecture, but I'm more than happy to discuss it with people at an appropriate time, place, and circumstance. And there will be appropriate time, place, and circumstances to bring it up. So I will say that.
Sure.
Regarding your first question, there's a difference between Veda and Vedanta. And so scientific knowledge is Veda. And there are many different Vedas. There are the four main Vedas: the Rig, the Atharva, the Sama, and the Yajur Veda. But then there's also like Dhanur Veda. There's there's a Veda for everything, right? And some of them are new, and some of them are older. And this is all the accumulated knowledge of humanity. And some of it is the accumulated knowledge of the ancient humanity. And even Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita tells Arjuna to not. This is not. He said, when you rise above, he said to pay no attention to these flowery words. And when you rise above them, you'll become indifferent to everything that they have to say. And that is because there's a difference between Veda and Vedanta. And although I appreciate Prishni's point, and I don't necessarily think that she's wrong with the point that she made, I do have a slightly different perspective on it, which is that Vedanta is conclusive knowledge. And so it is not, the knowledge is not going to change. And yes, the scientific laws are also immutable and our understanding of them grows, but Vaishnava Siddhanta is Vaishnava Siddhanta, and that's what it is. And it's something that descends to us and we grab a hold of, and we hope that somebody can pull us up. We try to struggle up on our own a little bit, but really we're praying that, Krishna is going to pull us up, and I just need to hold on. And what Vedanta is generally divided into two schools. There's an Advaita Vedantin school, which holds that there is no difference between the individual living entity as it perceives its uniqueness in the material world and the supreme absolute truth. And then there's Bhagavat Vedanta, which holds that the supreme absolute truth is its own individual, absolute, eternal person, and we are differentiated parts and parcels of that person. And Vedanta in that context is Bhakti Vedanta, which is the name of our institute. The conclusion of knowledge is Bhakti. And so that is what it is. And that really has very little to do with modern science. People were practicing Bhakti long before the internet, and we were doing a lot better job of it without the internet, frankly. But where does the conflict arise? The conflict arises because we read in the Bhagavatam of this thing called Bhumandala, which is a flat plane that doesn't nearly, come to close to even scratching the very surface of how big we know the universe to be. And I want to have absolute faith in this book, but this absolute faith in this book somehow goes against my sense of, what is real in the world. What we have agreed commonly in humanity upon as being real in the world. And so that's where the conflict arises. And we hope to delve into this in a deep and substantive manner over the course of the next couple of months.
Thank you.
That's all I can say about that.
So thank you very much, Ishwar, for your question. Kate has a question, and then we'll move on to Prishni, and then I have a question as well.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I think you were actually addressing my question just like moments ago, and I guess I was so attracted to hearing this lecture series because the word doubt was in the title, and I'm just looking for how do we reconcile our faith and our surrender with the doubts we have? Because in all honesty, if I'm being completely honest with myself, I have doubts every single day, but I also have faith every single day. So I guess that's too big of a question, and we'll get into it, or.
Well, I'll just say very briefly, and that's what we're getting into. So that is the question. I'll just say very briefly that both faith and doubt are functions of the intelligence. The intelligence. I gave the Bhagavad Gita class at the Alachua temple last week, and I was talking about the hierarchy of perception, about how our senses are superior to the dull matter that our body is made out of. because that's those are the vehicles with which we gather information about the world around us. But the mind is superior to the senses because the mind is that which organizes the information we gather through our senses. The really function of the mind is to decide what I like and what I don't like. This is good, this is bad. I don't like this. I like that. I want this. I don't want that, hot and cold, and so on and so forth. And it's really the intelligence that is what's governing what is right and what is wrong. And this is, if we knew this when we were born, we wouldn't have been born in the first place. So there's a bit of experiential learning going on here. And so having faith and having doubt, these are functions of the intelligence trying to help us figure out what is going on in this world. The question is, when is it appropriate to have faith, and when is it appropriate to use reason and doubt? And so it's not an either or, it's a when kind of question, I would say. I keep looking up here. I know this looks funny on the camera because the camera on the TV is up there, but it's putting the camera on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Doubts simultaneously. It's an ongoing part of the process. Krishni?
I just need to clarify the first comment I made because clearly it wasn't very clear. What I meant when I was talking about the tentative nature of spiritual and scientific knowledge, I was comparing scientific knowledge to an understanding of nature and then our own realization of an understanding of spiritual nature. So it's not that I'm not saying that scientific knowledge has at all on the caliber of Vedanta. I wasn't trying to make that comparison at all. We understand nature in a certain way, and we realize Vedanta in a certain way, and there's always some gap. It's this faith and doubt. There's always a gap between our understanding and the thing itself. And so, you have a pure devotee who might have a full understanding of Vedanta, but for most of us, our understanding of Vedanta is similar to a scientist's understanding of nature.
It's also evolving.
It's also so this idea that somehow as a Hare Krishna devotee, you know everything and the scientists don't know anything. We're both in the same position of, we have our realization about Vedanta and they have their realization about nature and they write that up in their papers and this, like we do our papers about this and this and this. And we're really talking about realization, which is always tentative.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. I totally agree with.
Okay.
Maybe I misunderstood you. Yeah.
I think I misspoke myself. So
thank you for saying.
Thank you. This is great. So it reminded me of, I think it was Saint Augustine who said, I believe so that I may understand. And so putting faith as the foundation for then trying to have some understanding about things. And it's also similar to Srila Prabhupada who says, suspend your disbelief just for a moment and then go in and see what happens.
This is called Shraddha.
Yeah.
That Prabhupada writes in the introduction of the Bhagavad Gita that if you're going to try to read this book and take its value, you should at least theoretically accept that Krishna is who he says he is. Yeah, so this is called, okay, I think this is a good idea. And then to get back to the question about knowledge and knowing, the question that also comes up in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam is, how do you know when you're hungry? You don't need somebody to tell you when you're hungry. You're just hungry. And how do you know when your hunger has been satisfied? You don't need to know somebody to tell you that your hunger has been satisfied. You just feel satisfied. And so spiritual knowledge, the Bhagavatam compares it to this hunger, that it is both nourishing and fulfilling. And you don't need anybody to tell you when you're being nourished and fulfilled. You just know it to be true. It's self-evident. And so although we as faithful devotees kind of just starting out on our spiritual paths, we often hear shabda, this evidence of hearing from an authority, as being emphasized. We have to hear from authorities, the Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad and this, that, and the other thing. Krishna actually says in the Bhagavad Gita that this knowledge is pratyaksha vargamam dharmyam. It is self-realized truth. It is realized by direct perception. And so our faith grows when we have experiences that strengthen our faith. Like I told this story a bunch of times, and maybe we'll stop after I tell it this time. But when I was moving down here from Canada to teach at the Bhaktivedanta Academy, I was teaching at a university in Alberta, Canada, which is like the middle of Canada, north of Salt Lake. Like it's a 12-hour drive due north of Salt Lake City, we'll say. Um, and the university closed down, the campus closed down because of COVID. And I asked my department chair if I could quarantine with my family in Orlando because my parents are old and they might need me during a pandemic. And he was like, "Yeah, fine, go have a blast." And then my boss at the school heard a rumor that I was moving down here, and so she invited me to um, come teach at the Gurukul here in Alachua. And I said yes without really thinking about it and packed everything I owned into my little Honda Civic. I was very happy that everything I owned fit into my little Honda Civic. And I drove in. The day before I crossed the US border, I camped out in a place called Osoyoos, which is like a beach resort town right on the US-Canada border in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. Just absolutely beautiful. And I parked my car in an underground garage in the hotel that I was staying at. And when I went to get in my car to drive all the way across the continent, to give up my academic career to teach Hare Krishna kids for basically no money in a place where I haven't been in 15 years, there was a peacock feather on the back trunk of my car in an underground parking lot in the winter in British Columbia. So this is a faith affirming experience. This is Krishna showing me that, yes, you are doing the right thing. And we all have experiences of this in our life. And if we are intelligent, we will embrace them for what we are. But then we also have experiences in our life. Well, hey, that guy might be dressed as a religious leader, but he's kind of creepy. Stranger danger. I don't care what color dhoti you're wearing, stranger danger. And that's a doubt. And and we have to also know how to evaluate our doubts. So yeah, Leela.
So okay,
I'm rambling again. Sorry.
No, thank you. That
Yeah,
actually
no.
leads into what I wanted to ask, because you gave this list of the science or part of how we come to these conclusions, that's quantitative, repeatable, peer reviewed, cumulative. I think there was another one that's missing. Why is it that our subjective experience is not measurable, especially when we're using the subtle senses to gather information? Why is it that the subtle senses can't gather subtle information? And why is it that we can't use, say, behavioral science as something that we can quantify to explain the metaphysical? So, can I quantify, are people happier? Are people more peaceful compared to how we can quantify that the world is anxious? And we can quantify that the world is depressed, but why can't we quantify happiness and peacefulness and our general response to life and say this is a scientific process? Because we can quantify it, we can repeat it, it can be peer reviewed. It's cumulative, and so what is where does it break down that people are still separating and divorcing science from spirituality?
Talking more specifically about consciousness and theories of consciousness now, and we do talk about behavioral sciences, and there are rigorous methods by which to measure these things, and we even have devotees in our own community that have done, first of all, generated statistically valid and reliable surveys to measure happiness in a devotional context, and also to measure yeah, absolutely,
spirituality accepted by the scientific community.
I disagree with that premise to begin with. I mean, I think there's a lot of literature in peer-reviewed scientific neurology type studies, behavioral sciences that do show the subjective benefits of spirituality in people's lives to reduce mental illness, to reduce stress, anxiety, to promote just general health and well-being. I think there's a lot of literature on that in the scientific.
Change the mechanistic perspective.
The issue gets down to a mechanistic perspective. So if we're talking about things like depression and anxiety, we can't really measure what somebody's subjective experience of that is. Like, I get depressed sometimes and you get depressed sometimes, but is my experience of depression the same as your experience of depression? Who knows? What we can know is that depression is related to changes in the fluctuations of the autonomic nervous system or changes in production of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And so that we can measure. In the same way, I mean, the age-old question is, I'm seeing purple and you're seeing purple, but do you see purple the same way that I see purple? And there's really no way of knowing that. What we can know is that purple gives off a certain purple, what we see as purple is reflecting a certain electromagnetic vibration, that there are molecules in my eye that respond to that and send a message to my brain. And so that we can see is the same. You perceive purple. The mechanisms of you perceiving purple are the same as my mechanisms perceiving purple, but I don't know if you see this as the same color that I do. And there's no way I can ever know that. Yeah.
Yeah, this also speaks to the difference between what are called the hard sciences and the soft sciences.
Yeah.
And there's kind of this like, cultural bias where the hard science people who are in the hard scientists who are like, okay, we look at the external world and we measure things according to our instruments, physics and chemistry and to some, to biology to a large extent. But and then and they kind of have this like superiority complex over the soft sciences, which is like economic, like behavioral economics, psychology, sociology, that kind of thing. And I think it comes down to
Anthropology and archaeology.
yes, exactly, yeah, anthropology, archaeology, and I think it comes down to this issue of subjectivity. That subjectivity, which comes from consciousness, cannot really be mechanistically measured in the same way that you can measure, what a kilometer is or what a milliliter is, to use various
metric units. Yes. Yeah, and I think that also gets back to the central premise. This is there's a term in the Bhagavad Gita, Maya Parita Gyan, where Krishna is talking about people that deviate from him or from pursuing a path of spirituality. And Maya Parita Gyan is somebody whose knowledge has been stolen by illusion. That we know so much. This is my opinion about the Big Bang, and we'll do the Big Bang not next week, but the week after. The people who have studied the Big Bang and have researched the Big Bang, I think these people are exactly right, and they've completely missed the point. Both they both understand what they are observing exactly correctly, and they have no idea what it is supposed to mean simultaneously. Their knowledge has been stolen by illusion, and this speaks to the central premise of what I'm trying to put across: is that knowledge is actually is a purification of consciousness. Now we become self-realized when our consciousness is clean, right? When we become situated in the mode of goodness and then onto the transcendental platform. All of the truths of the Vedas, Prabhupada said about Lord Brahma, became self-evident to him by dint of his austerity. All of the truths of the Vedas became self-evident to him, Prabhupada said about Lord Brahma in his purport to the Brahma Samhita. So this is what we are advocating to the world: is the austerity is not to spend another $5 billion on a particle accelerator. The austerity is to stop eating hamburgers for 6 months. If you really want to save the world, I know I'm preaching to the choir right now, but if you really want to save the world, stop eating hamburgers. Horrible. Yeah, I think.
On that note,
On that note, it's time for pizza.
So yes, Christina.
To your point about what true knowledge is, I very much agree with that. And like something that was interesting to me when you were explaining your presentation was your thought experiment about the
Roman Empire,
unknowable area, unconfirmed.
Unconformity.
The unconformity, the great unconformity, yeah, and how all the thousands, like around 1,000 Roman empires could have risen and fallen in that space, and it was that kind of reminded me of one of Sadhguta's arguments from the other direction, saying that like, people who Darwinian evolutionists, they say like, oh yeah, there were these in between missing link plants, but we can't find evidence of them because they were in like a place where there was like a flood, and then the evidence just like was is missing from the record. And so I thought it was interesting how your thought experiment and Sadhguta's sort of somewhat um, antagonistic quotations of the scientists, that argument is similar, and I think that really speaks to how knowledge is what you're ultimately saying, which is that purification of consciousness. Because you can do the thought experiments, and the thought experiments are kind of interesting, but you can also kind of bend that in lots of different directions.
Yeah. Okay.
Very nice.
We got one more.
One more
I know. I saw
thing.
you've been waiting patiently. I did start a
Um,
little late also, so go ahead.
I just had a comment and then a quick question on going back to a question that was in the chat is seeing knowing. And I like to quote, believe half of what you see and nothing that you hear. Um, and I would answer no, that seeing is not always knowing because of illusion, right? A movie where you see an actor do a stunt, he has a double, but thinking that this is the actor doing it. Having said that, realizing myself personally that I cannot believe everything that I see, kind of what catapulted me into believing in the unseen more, even almost more. Okay. So, also kind of along with what she was asking and why I'm so interested in the difference between science and religion is the the element of spirit, right? Can spirit be quantified? And is there any type of uh, um, um, use for literally the element of the spirit in the human that animates it in science?
Well, this is a huge question.
Okay.
And I don't want to get into it
That's
do
fine.
wrap up for the day. I will say that
Huh.
um, one of the main, so I would go back to Francis Bacon, who and the central idea of scientism, which is what science has become in our society, is that science should be used to elevate the condition of humanity. But through the scientific method, we can elevate the condition of humanity. Over the years, and I think as Kali Yuga has progressed, what we really see is that continued investiture in scientific research to a large extent is no longer really geared towards understanding matters of the spirit as it was back when Isaac Newton, and even in the early 20th century, up to the early 20th century, people who were really investigating scientific questions with the aim of really understanding how God's nature works, to using scientific method to try to understand how we can exploit nature. Like, how can I use this resource for my sense gratification? And so that is an issue, that the scientific method has, um, maybe through no fault of its own, maybe just because that's how humans are built, is geared towards exploitation of material resources. How can I master this? And that is, in my opinion, where science and religion really start to diverge, is that religious practice is geared towards becoming a servant and a steward of Krishna's energy, whereas scientific knowledge is often used in an exploitative and unsustainable manner that is in fact hurtling us towards disaster, like catastrophic disaster on the planet. I mean, they had to close the Fort Lauderdale airport because it was raining last week in Florida. That's a problem. Anyway, let's stop there and eat some pizza. We can carry on these discussions next week. Thank you all so much for coming online.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you in person.
Thank you for those of you who joined us online, those of you who are here in person. We'll see you next week. Do you have the title for next week's? Oh, you've already told us what it's about.
We don't have a title, but we will be discussing, we will be using the idea that the earth might be flat and how we really know that it isn't as a means of exploring the nature of evidence and what the burden of proof in a reasonable society is.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So look forward to that. Thank you all very much.
All your troll friends.
Yeah.
We will mute them.
Discussion
Leap
and
of flats and doubt.
a very big thank you to Dr. Jonathan Banks for Charnanda Das. Thank you very much for sharing all of this with us, and we'll see you all next week. Hare Krishna.
Jai.